The courtroom buzzed with the usual tension that came before cross-examination. The low murmur of attorneys whispering to their assistants, the scratching of pens against yellow legal pads, the mechanical click of the court reporter preparing her transcript file. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting sterile light across a space charged with unspoken electricity. But there was something else in the air today, something sharper, like a blade unsheathed just beneath the surface. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi. She wasn't pacing, she wasn't theatrically shuffling through notes. She stood perfectly, still behind the polished oak defense table, one hand resting gently on a thin folder, the other tucked beneath her elbow. Her gaze was locked on the witness currently seated in the box. A man in his late 40s, neatly dressed, with a mouth full of carefully chosen words and eyes that didn't quite know where to land. The prosecution had put him forward as their key witness. A supposedly unimpeachable character witness with direct knowledge of the defendant's whereabouts, motives, and intentions. He spoke with fluency, with polish. He had a smile ready for the jury and just enough emotion to sound sincere, but not so much that he lost control. He was good. Too good. Pam had been watching him for the last 20 minutes, silently cataloging every nervous tick, every inconsistency in tone, every half-second pause when a question brushed too close to something real. She knew this game. She'd seen it before, in courtrooms, in hearings, in high-profile interviews and closed-door depositions. There was a certain rhythm liars developed when they were practiced. It was always too smooth at first, always a bit rehearsed. And this man was rehearsed. She waited until the judge gave the nod. "Ms. Bondi, your witness." Pam stepped forward not with urgency, but with precision. Her heels clicked against the marble floor like a metronome, measured, inevitable. She didn't bother glancing at the jury yet. She knew they were watching her. She could feel it. The room was already leaning in. The witness straightened slightly as she approached, trying to appear composed, but his hands betrayed him. Fingers, clenching too tight around the edge of the witness box, knuckles paling just beneath the skin. Pam opened her folder without breaking eye contact, flipped once, twice, then looked up. "Mr. Densmore," she said softly, as if beginning a conversation rather than an interrogation. "You stated under oath that on the evening of March 17th, at approximately 8:45 p.m., you personally witnessed my client entering the property on Westmore Drive, is that correct?" "Yes," he said, his voice steady but not quite relaxed. "And you said you were parked across the street in your vehicle, waiting for a rideshare pickup at the time?" He nodded. "That's right." Pam's tone remained casual. "What was the make and model of the vehicle you were driving that night?" He blinked. "Excuse me?" "The vehicle you were in. You said it was yours. What kind?" Ford Focus, silver, 2014. Pam jotted a single word on her pad, then looked back up. "And the license plate number?" He hesitated. I don't remember." "You don't remember your own license plate?" Well, not off the top of my head." "I don't usually have to." Pam gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Fair enough." She flipped to a new page in the folder. "Did you happen to notice any other cars on the street?" "A few, yes. How many? Maybe 3. It was dark. Any streetlights out?" "Not that I recall." Pam nodded again. Her voice remained calm, but her posture shifted. More squared now, more deliberate. "Mr. Densmore, how far were you parked from the front entrance of the property?" "Maybe 50 feet? Hard to say." "And you say you saw my client, clearly, enter the home?" "I did." Pam's voice dropped just slightly. "Despite it being dark, from 50 feet away, from inside your car, with no binoculars, through tinted glass." There was a pause. "I had the window cracked." She held that moment in the air. Let it breathe. Then, she reached into the folder and pulled out a photograph, an aerial shot of the street on Westmore Drive. She approached the witness stand and handed it to him. "Is this the street you were on?" He studied it. "Yes." "Could you point to where your car was parked?" He took a moment, then jabbed a finger toward a spot on the map. Pam turned toward the jury now for the first time, stepping to the side so they could see the photo as it was displayed on the projection screen. Thank you, she said. So, from this location, she moved to the next photo, now showing the exact angle from the witness's claimed viewpoint. This is the sightline to the front door. She held it up. The front door was completely obscured by a hedge wall, nearly 6 feet high. Pam let the silence do its work before she spoke again. Mr. Densmore, she said softly, would you care to explain how you managed to see my client enter a front door that isn't visible from where you claim to be sitting? His mouth opened, then closed. Pam stepped forward, voice still, measured but now with unmistakable steel behind it. Were you ever on that street at all? He swallowed hard. I told the prosecution, yes or no. No. The courtroom rippled with sudden movement. Someone in the gallery gasped. The stenographer's fingers stalled for half a second. Pam didn't react. She just looked at the judge. Permission to treat the witness as hostile, Your Honor. The judge, stone-faced, gave a single nod. Pam Bondi turned back to the witness, her folder snapping shut like a gavel. And in that instant, everyone in the courtroom understood. The witness wasn't just unraveling, he was about to be destroyed. Pam Bondi didn't wait for the courtroom to settle. She didn't need theatrics to seize the room. She already had it. Every juror's eye was on her, riveted. The witness, now officially labeled hostile, sat stiffly in the box, a faint flush climbing his neck, his eyes darting toward the prosecution's table, as if silently begging for rescue. But there would be none. Pam stepped back toward her table, with the controlled calm of someone who had already mapped out the next 10 moves. She slid out a second folder, thicker, stamped with a date in bold red ink. Without looking at the witness, she spoke again. Mr. Densmore, you stated in your sworn testimony that you had no prior relationship with the prosecution, correct? He cleared his throat. That's right. Pam flipped open the folder and drew out a stack of documents bound together by a black clip. She walked to the bench slowly with measured purpose and handed a copy to the judge, another to the court clerk, then finally approached the witness stand. Then would you mind explaining these text messages you exchanged with the lead investigator, in this case, Mr. Trellin, for nearly 3 weeks before you were ever added to the witness list? The man's mouth fell slightly open. Julian Trellin, the prosecution's star investigator, suddenly shifted at his table, whispering something urgently to the assistant district attorney beside him. The ADA's jaw clenched as he stared down at his notes, no longer taking the performance so casually. Pam lifted the first page for the jury to see. Highlighted text glowed under the projection screen lights. From you, March 3rd, 10:02 p.m., she read aloud. Quote, I can put him there if you need me to. I know the layout. Gasps, small, breathy, and uncontrollable, from the gallery, from the jury box, even from the bailiff standing rigid near the rear door. Densmore's hands trembled. That's not what I meant. Pam's tone sharpened, for the first time. It's exactly what you meant, Mr. Densmore, and the jury knows it. She turned again, flipping to another page. March 4th, 8:17 a.m. I checked with the neighbor, there's a blind spot. I could say I saw him go through the gate. That's believable, right? Pam snapped the binder shut with a clean, decisive sound. You weren't a witness. You were a construction project, built to fill a hole in a failing narrative. And now, you've just admitted it, on record. The prosecution leapt to their feet. Objection! Badgering the witness, Pam. Turned slowly, her voice calm but coated in frost. Your Honor, the witness perjured himself under oath, falsified his testimony, and coordinated with the state's own investigator. I am not badgering. I am excavating. The judge didn't respond at first, flipping slowly through the photocopied text transcripts in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes fell on the prosecutor like a hammer. Objection overruled. Pam turned back to Densmore. You do understand that perjury is a criminal offense, Mr. Densmore? He nodded mutely. And that falsifying testimony in a felony trial carries additional penalties? Another nod. His lips barely moved. His previous charm had bled out of him entirely. All that remained was the pale mask of a man who had gambled with the truth and lost. Pam paused for just a moment, let the weight of that truth settle into every corner of the room before she spoke again. "Let's walk back, shall we?" she said, voice now eerily calm, deliberate. "Why did you lie about being there?" I was told it would help." "Help? Who?" He didn't answer. Pam took a single step closer. "Help who, Mr. Densmore?" He glanced toward the prosecution's table again. Pam followed his gaze. "Was it Investigator Trellin who asked you to fabricate the sighting?" The ADA objected, but the judge raised his hand sharply. "She's earned the question. Answer it." Densmore looked like a man drowning in a tide of his own making. Finally, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "Yes." A collective shiver went through the courtroom. The jury sat frozen, as if afraid to blink. The gallery leaned forward. Even the court reporter paused for a half beat. Before continuing her furious typing, Pam didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply returned to her table, retrieved a single photograph, and held it up. "This is a still from a streetlight camera that night, 8:45 p.m. Westmore Drive. No Ford Focus, no Densmore, just two empty curbs." She laid the photo on the stand in front of him like it was his tombstone. "You lied," she said, final and absolute. "And you got caught." Then she turned toward the jury, her voice rising just enough to carry clarity, not theatrics. "Ladies and gentlemen, if this is the kind of truth the state has built its case on, ask yourselves, what else have they built for your benefit? And what have they buried?" She stepped away from the stand, calm, composed, and victorious. And as she returned to her seat, the courtroom seemed to lean with her, gravity shifting toward the only person in the room who hadn't flinched. Pam Bondi. The woman who had just dismantled a lie so cleanly, the truth had no choice but to stand up and face the room. The courtroom had changed. It no longer resembled a place of cold, formal process. It had become something else, alive, volatile, trembling with the aftershocks of what had just unfolded. Pam Bondi's cross-examination hadn't simply discredited a witness, it had ignited a firestorm of doubt that now curled through every crevice of the state's case. Mr. Densmore, the prosecution's once confident cornerstone, sat limp in the witness chair like a puppet with its strings abruptly severed. His mouth hung open slightly and his eyes stared ahead at nothing, as if the weight of his own collapse had stunned even him. Pam didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The judge leaned forward slightly, his brow low and stormy. "Court will recess for 20 minutes, he said, his voice hard and short. "Both legal teams will remain in the courtroom. The witness is to be held pending perjury review." The gavel struck once, and just like that, the courtroom erupted, not into noise, but into motion. Bailiffs moved forward to escort Densmore away, their faces impassive, but their pace urgent. The gallery buzzed with the kind of whispering usually reserved for scandalous verdicts. Even the jury, though forbidden to discuss the case, exchanged glances that trembled with shared shock. Pam Bondi remained seated at her table, still like a blade resting in its sheath, dangerous even when not in motion. Her client sat beside her, breathing shallow, his eyes wide in disbelief, as if he had just watched someone pull him back from the edge of an abyss. He turned his head toward her. "How did you know?" Pam's eyes didn't leave the table in front of her. "Because liars always reach just a little too far," she said softly. "And when they do, they leave fingerprints." Across the room, the prosecutors were in chaos. The ADA was hunched over his briefcase, pulling out files and hissing instructions to his legal aide. Investigator Trellin had moved to the back corner of the room, his arms folded tightly, his jaw grinding in rapid, panicked silence. Pam's gaze lifted slowly. She didn't look angry. She looked exact. The court clerk approached the bench to speak privately with the judge. The recess clock was ticking down, but nobody moved to leave the room. No one wanted to miss what was next. Then, quietly, the courtroom door creaked open. Into the heavy quiet walked someone unexpected. Marshall Lang, the private investigator Pam had quietly brought onto the defense team months earlier. He wore a gray blazer, no tie, and carried a manila envelope tucked under one arm. He walked straight to Pam and handed it to her with a nod. Timestamps, server pulls, social metadata, all verified. Pam took the envelope without a word. She opened it, skimmed quickly, and then leaned toward her co-counsel. Everything's lined up. Every message, every call Densmore made. The connection goes straight to Trellin. Her co-counsel blinked. That's witness tampering. Pam didn't smile. No, that's prosecutorial fabrication, and if the court accepts this evidence, we've got a shot at ending this entire trial within days. Meanwhile, across the aisle, the prosecution team had begun to fracture. The ADA leaned over to Trellin, whispering fiercely, "What the hell did you tell him to say?" Trellin's response was a breathless, defensive growl. "He said he could place the guy at the house. I didn't tell him anything." "You gave him the damn street layout. That's guidance. That's contamination." Pam watched them carefully. She didn't need to hear every word. Body language did most of the speaking. And then, as if the courtroom itself wanted to emphasize her advantage, the recess timer struck 0. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the judge returned to the bench with a face like granite. Pam stood slowly, her hands sliding across the table to lift the manila folder Marshall Lang had delivered. She didn't hesitate. She walked directly to the clerk and handed over the documents. "Supplemental evidence, Your Honor," she said clearly, "pertinent to both witness reliability and prosecutorial conduct." The clerk passed it to the judge. As the judge began, flipping through the contents, the pages whispered like storm winds building on a quiet plain. After a moment, he looked up. His voice was different now, lower, loaded with consequence. "Counsel, I will review this thoroughly. If what is alleged here proves accurate, this court will be forced to consider a mistrial motion and a full disciplinary inquiry into state conduct." Pam gave a single nod. "Understood, Your Honor." The judge turned to the prosecution. "You will respond to this filing by morning, in writing, and with full transparency." The ADA swallowed visibly. "Yes, Your Honor." Court adjourned. Again, but this time, no one moved. They all simply stood there, stunned, watching Pam Bondi walk back to her seat. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just undeniable, because she hadn't just exposed a liar. She had cut into the bones of the case, exposing rot where the prosecution had painted polish, and everyone knew. This trial had just been turned inside out, and Pam Bondi was nowhere near finished. When court resumed the following morning, the atmosphere inside the chamber had changed entirely. The grandeur of the room, its gleaming wood panels, soaring ceiling, and brass-accented fixtures, suddenly felt less like a stage for justice and more like a vault holding the pieces of a shattered illusion. The jury filed in with eyes cast forward but filled with guarded curiosity. They had seen something break yesterday, not just a witness, but the very narrative they were asked to believe. Pam Bondi stood at the defense table, poised and unreadable, her notes arranged with surgical precision. Her co-counsel beside her remained still, saying nothing, because they both knew that silence now was not weakness, it was power. Across the aisle, the prosecution's table looked haggard. The ADA had dark circles under his eyes and a stack of disheveled legal pads in front of him, each one filled with desperate scrawlings from a sleepless night of damage control. Investigator Trellin was notably absent. The judge returned to the bench at precisely 9 a.m. He looked over the rim of his glasses, his eyes razor sharp. A copy of Pam's supplemental evidence sat thick in front of him, annotated with colored tabs and pink post-it notes bearing his own narrow handwriting. "Before we proceed," the judge began, voice hard as stone, "this court will address the matter introduced yesterday concerning the reliability of the state's witness and the potential misconduct of its investigative body." He let that sentence hang in the air like a blade. Pam rose. "Your Honor, in light of the newly submitted communications between Mr. Densmore and Investigator Trellin, including messages that suggested narrative coordination and the potential..." planting of location details, we are now prepared to file a formal motion to dismiss the charges based on compromised due process. Murmurs fluttered through the gallery. The ADA rose hastily. Your Honor, we request time to verify the authenticity of those communications before any ruling is made. While we acknowledge the troubling nature of the content, it is premature to base a dismissal on transcripts that have yet to be independently reviewed. The judge's glare could have cracked glass. You had all night, counsel. These messages are time-stamped, verified through third-party metadata authentication, and cross-referenced with your own investigative logs. The court is satisfied with their legitimacy for the purpose of this hearing. The ADA stiffened. Understood. Pam took a single step forward. Her voice was steady and direct. I would also like to call a new witness, Your Honor. The defense's private investigator, Mr. Marshall Lang, who retrieved and verified these messages and can testify as to the methods used and the chain of custody of digital evidence. The aye? Judge nodded. Granted. Call your witness. Marshall Lang took the stand, dressed in the same gray blazer from the day before. He didn't fumble. He didn't perform. He answered with precision and brevity, explaining how Densmore's phone had been accessed legally under subpoena, how server backups provided the needed data, and how IP logins showed direct contact between the witness and the lead investigator at one point, when asked by Pam whether there was any evidence that the story provided by the witness originated independently, Lang gave a simple but chilling answer. None. In fact, the earliest version of Mr. Densmore's testimony was almost word-for-word identical to an internal case note filed by Investigator Trellin days before they ever officially spoke. Gasps. Not from the gallery this time, but from one of the jurors, audible, immediate. Pam turned slowly to face the jury. This wasn't a bad witness, she said. This was a constructed narrative, brick by brick, not based on truth, but on convenience, not verified by evidence but designed to replace it. The ADA objected again, weakly this time. The judge overruled him before he even finished the sentence. When Lang stepped down, the courtroom wasn't just shaken, it was transformed. The prosecution's case had gone from strong to suspect, from credible to corrupted, and no amount of legal fencing could rebuild it in real time. But Pam wasn't finished. She approached the bench and requested to recall the original arresting officer, not to challenge the arrest itself, but to examine the timeline leading up to it. Under oath, and with mounting discomfort, the officer admitted that his report had been adjusted post-submission. He hesitated before confessing that those changes had been suggested by none other than Investigator Trellin. The original report never mentioned a witness. The witness was added later. The courtroom stilled. The judge took off his glasses and set them down slowly. I am placing Investigator Trellin under immediate summons, he said. His failure to appear this morning has now escalated into contempt, and this court will be conducting an evidentiary hearing into the conduct of the prosecution. He turned to the jury. Members of the jury, I remind you that no assumptions should be made until all testimony is completed. However, you are to be aware that material questions now exist regarding the integrity of this trial. Pam Bondi sat down, her expression unchanged, though the faintest flicker of fire burned in her eyes. Her client turned to her, overwhelmed, with quiet disbelief. I can't believe it's unraveling like this, he whispered. Pam looked straight ahead. It didn't unravel, she replied. I cut it loose. The day adjourned early. The court recessed not in preparation for another witness, but for a storm. A legal storm that now threatened not just the outcome of the case, but the careers and credibility of those who had brought it to court. Prosecutors whispered among themselves, avoiding eye contact with the media waiting just outside the doors. Pam Bondi stood alone at the center of it all, surrounded by shattered illusions and unspoken truths now dragging themselves into the light. She had come to defend her client. Now she was defending the courtroom itself, and tomorrow she would finish what she had started. The next morning arrived like the calm before a tidal wave. The courthouse exterior looked unchanged, sunlight glinting off stone columns, suited attorneys milling in tight groups, cameras stationed across the street like soldiers waiting for the first crack in the wall. But inside courtroom 12B, everything was different. The foundations had shifted. What began as a standard felony trial had now become a slow-motion detonation, with each moment revealing deeper fractures in the prosecution's case, each revelation dragging more of the truth into the open. Pam Bondi entered the courtroom without ceremony. She didn't pause for the cameras. She didn't offer a statement. Her presence was the statement. Flawless posture, crisp black suit, calm expression carved from focus. She didn't need to announce the storm. She was the storm. Inside, her co-counsel was already at the table, reviewing notes, but Pam needed no reminders. She remembered every name, every timestamp, every inconsistency. Every tool in her arsenal was already sharpened and in reach. Today wasn't about laying groundwork. Today was about exposure. The courtroom filled faster than usual. Word had gotten out. Something seismic was happening in 12B, and no one wanted to miss it. Legal interns crowded into the back rows. Reporters jostled for seating. Even a few off-duty judges took up quiet positions in the gallery. They weren't there for gossip. They were there to watch something rare, a trial consuming itself from the inside out, and the woman feeding the fire with precision. Judge Matheson entered, his expression grave. Everyone rose. Everyone sat. The bailiff called order. Before we proceed, the judge began, I must inform the court that investigator Julian Trellin has refused voluntary appearance. A court order has been issued for his detainment. We have every reason to believe he has retained private counsel and is actively avoiding service. A stunned murmur swept through the room. The lead investigator, the man whose case notes had supposedly guided the witness testimony, the man who had anchored the prosecution's strategy, was now in hiding. That wasn't just a red flag. It was a detonation. Pam rose, already prepared. Your Honor, given the absence of Mr. Trellin and the mounting evidence of investigative misconduct, we formally renew our motion for dismissal of all charges against the defendant. Additionally, we request a contempt hearing and full evidentiary inquiry into the actions of the state's legal team. The ADA rose, his voice taut with urgency. We dispute the characterization of misconduct. Mr. Trellin's absence, while deeply concerning, should not reflect on the integrity of the state's case as a whole. The defendant's actions, Pam cut in, calm but absolute. The defendant's actions have been buried beneath fabricated reports, tampered timelines, and a star witness who admitted to lying under oath. With respect, counsel, your case doesn't exist anymore. It evaporated the moment your own witness looked the jury in the eye and said, I wasn't there. The judge held up a hand. This court will take final arguments before ruling. Pam turned, slowly, powerfully. She stepped forward, placing one hand on the edge of the jury box, speaking directly to the people whose decision had once seemed distant, but now loomed like judgment itself. When this trial began, you were asked to trust a story, a clean, confident, heavily edited narrative. You were told the defendant was seen, that he was identified, that there was no mistake, but the truth, as you've seen, was far from clean. She let her words breathe. You watched a key witness fall apart under questioning. You saw text messages that proved testimony was built, not discovered. You watched a lead investigator disappear when called to account. And you know what that means. You feel it in your gut. She turned, pacing slowly, not with arrogance, but with the kind of energy that comes from earned clarity. Justice cannot exist in a courtroom built on convenience. You were called here not just to decide on facts, but to detect lies. And that's what you've done. You've seen the manipulation, the orchestration, the concealment. Now it's time to finish what we started. Her voice dropped slightly. Let the truth stand. Not the version someone wanted you to believe, but the one you saw unfold with your own eyes. She returned to her table, said nothing more. The ADA's rebuttal was brief, measured, but empty. He spoke of procedure, of intent, of the value of due process. But the words rang hollow now. The courtroom had already shifted. The tide had turned, and no eloquence could pull it back. The judge recessed for deliberation. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. When he returned, the room froze. He took his seat, lifted the sheet of paper in front of him, looked out at the gallery, at the jury, at the weight of what was about to be declared. This court finds that the integrity of the trial has been fatally compromised by witness manipulation, improper investigative conduct, and repeated obfuscation of material evidence. He turned toward the jury. The charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Gasps echoed. The gallery didn't erupt. It exhaled. The tension that had coiled in every corner of the room unraveled in a silent release. Some eyes welled with tears. The defendant's head dropped into his hands, breath shuddering out of him. Pam Bondi sat still for a moment. Then she rose. She shook her client's hand, whispered something only he could hear. And then, as she gathered her notes, the judge's voice returned once more. "Ms. Bondi," he said, "this court recognizes your exceptional conduct in defense of truth and your client's rights. It does not go unnoticed." She met his eyes, nodded once. "No one should have to fight this hard for honesty, Your Honor," she said. "But when they do, I'll be ready." She walked out of the courtroom without fanfare. No cameras, no victory speech, just the sound of footsteps that carried the weight of something undeniable. Pam Bondi didn't just win the case, she rescued the truth from its grave. And tomorrow, if the system dared bury it again, she would dig it up all over again. Outside the courthouse, the day unfolded like any other. Traffic groaned down distant city streets, pigeons wheeled above rooftops, and the sun climbed indifferently toward its zenith. But within a 4-block radius of Courtroom 12B, the atmosphere was entirely different. Word had spread like a spark in dry grass. Pam Bondi did it again. She exited through the front steps, her stride even, expression unreadable beneath the weight of what had just transpired. Reporters swarmed, their microphones outstretched like lances. Questions flew, some frantic, some rehearsed, some begging for controversy. "Ms. Bondi, do you believe the prosecution acted criminally? Will you be filing a misconduct complaint? Was this a cover-up? Did you anticipate the witness collapse?" She didn't answer at first. She just looked ahead. The truth was still settling, coiling itself around headlines and legal circles, around whispers in law offices and hushed conversations at lunch counters. But then she stopped, just for a moment, and turned to face the chaos. Her voice was clear, but low, not defensive, deliberate. "This case wasn't just about proving my client innocent," she said. "It was about proving that lies don't get to wear suits and sit behind microphones unchallenged. The courtroom is sacred, and if anyone dares poison it with deceit, they'll find someone like me standing in the way." Then she turned, walked past the flashbulbs and headlines, and disappeared into the city, swallowed by the very streets she'd sworn to protect. Inside the courthouse, the aftershocks still rippled. The ADA sat in his office, head bowed over a desk now cluttered with subpoenas and disciplinary notices. There were calls he didn't want to return, emails he couldn't bring himself to open. Somewhere across town, a disbarment panel was already reviewing the chain of failures that had led to this implosion: Densmore's perjury, Trellan's evasion, the falsified timelines, the adjusted arrest report. What had been passed off as standard procedure had been methodically exposed as rot, and it was Pam who had done the cutting. At the local bar association, junior lawyers were still dissecting the transcript of her cross-examination. Law. Students studied the footage, pausing each time she laid a trap and watching, frame by frame, as a false story unraveled with surgical clarity. They didn't talk about it like gossip. They studied it like scripture. Meanwhile, Pam's client, once accused, nearly convicted, sat in a quiet diner with his wife and daughter, staring out the window as though the world looked entirely different now. He still hadn't said much. How could he? How do you speak after the system tried to erase you, only to watch one woman pull your name back from the edge like it was a flag that refused to fall? He finally opened his mouth, voice hoarse. How do you even thank someone for that? His wife answered quietly. You live better, every day, that's how. And he nodded, because somewhere he knew. His freedom had been bought not with luck, not with a technicality, but with truth, carved out of stone and fire by someone who never once hesitated to challenge power. Pam returned to her office later, that evening, well after the courthouse had emptied and the cameras had turned to other stories. The building was quiet, the city dimming into dusk. She dropped her briefcase beside the desk and stood for a long moment in the doorway, staring at the wall across from her, lined with case files, old photographs, awards she never mentioned, and a framed quote in small gold print. Justice is never automatic. It's dragged, bleeding, into the light. She sat down slowly, flipping open a new folder. New name, new case, new fight, no rest, not yet. Because the system never stopped moving, and every time it stumbled, every time it forgot its own rules, Pam Bondi would be there, standing between the truth and the darkness trying to bury it. She didn't chase glory. She didn't beg for credit. She simply refused to lose. And in that refusal, courtroom by courtroom, she wasn't just defending the accused. She was defending the soul of justice itself, and she was just getting started.